Ethan Carter and his wife Lena had just moved into their new countryside home with their loyal German shepherd, Max. The house stood on the edge of a dense forest, surrounded by silence and endless trees. As they unpacked, Max remained unusually alert, staring toward the woods with his ears pricked forward. That night, Ethan was woken by Max's low growl. The dog stood by the bedroom door, staring down the dark hallway. A chilling howl echoed from outside, sending shivers down Ethan's spine. Max bolted from the room, barking furiously at something beyond the porch. Ethan grabbed a flashlight and followed. But when he shone the beam outside, there was nothing there, just an empty yard bathed in moonlight. Lena urged him to close the door, her unease growing as Max suddenly whined and backed away. Ethan locked the door, but the eerie silence that followed was worse than the sound. As they returned to bed, Ethan swore he heard it again. The same howl, but this time, it was closer. The next morning, Ethan stepped onto the porch, his breath catching as he noticed strange paw prints trailing across the dewy grass. They were large, deep, and led directly from the woods to their front steps. Max sniffed at them warily, his tail stiff, his body tense. "Those don't look like his," Lena murmured, stepping beside Ethan. "They're too big." Ethan nodded, following the prints with his eyes. They stopped abruptly just before the porch, as if whatever had made them had vanished into thin air. That night, Max refused to settle. He paced near the front door, growling at the darkness beyond. The air inside the house felt thick, heavy with something unseen. At midnight, the howling returned, closer, more urgent. Max barked wildly, scratching at the door. Ethan, his heart pounding, grabbed the flashlight and peered outside. A shadow moved at the edge of the trees, tall and unnatural. The wind howled through the trees, but it wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something watching. Then, as suddenly as it had come, the presence was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained. Ethan woke up to Max barking aggressively at the window. The morning light streamed in, but the dog's hackles were raised, his stance rigid. "What is it now, boy?" Ethan muttered, rubbing his eyes as he walked over. He expected to see a deer or maybe a stray dog, but instead, the forest beyond the yard seemed different. The trees stood eerily still, no wind rustling their leaves. And then, something caught his eye. Between the trees, there were more of those massive paw prints. They trailed deeper into the woods, vanishing into the shadows. "I think we should check it out," Ethan said, pulling on his jacket. Lena hesitated. "Ethan, that thing, whatever it is, was here last night. What if it's still out there?" He kissed her on the forehead. "I won't go far, just to see what we're dealing with." Max insisted on coming, his body tense, but his loyalty unwavering. Together, they followed the trail of prints, the quiet of the woods pressing against them like a heavy blanket. Birds weren't chirping. The usual forest sounds were absent. Every step felt like a disturbance in something ancient. Then, Max stopped. His ears flicked back, his body lowered to a defensive stance. A deep growl rumbled in his chest. Ethan followed. The dogs gazed and saw it, a set of yellow eyes watching them from behind a tree, too high off the ground to belong to any ordinary animal. The shape in the shadows was tall, hunched, unnatural. A deep, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. Max barked fiercely, snapping his jaws. Whatever was there didn't move. It just watched. Then, in an instant, it was gone. The underbrush didn't rustle. The branches didn't sway. It simply disappeared. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned on his heel. "Come on, Max, we're going back." They hurried back to the house, Max checking behind them every few steps. When Ethan reached the porch, Lena was already waiting, eyes wide with worry. "What did you see?" she asked. Breathlessly, Ethan hesitated before answering. He wasn't sure he wanted to put it into words, because whatever was out there, it was hunting them. That night, the air in the house felt different, thicker, heavier, as if it carried something unseen. Max refused to rest, pacing near the front door, his ears twitching at every sound. Ethan and Lena sat in the living room, the TV playing softly, but neither of them was really paying attention. Then came the sound. A slow, deliberate scratching against the wooden door. Ethan bolted upright. "Did you hear that?" Lena nodded, her face pale. Max stood rigid, a low growl vibrating through his chest. He moved toward the door cautiously, his nose twitching. Ethan reached for the flashlight and a baseball bat he kept nearby, his heart hammering. The scratching stopped. Ethan took a deep breath and inched toward the door. Max barked sharply, lunging toward it, but Ethan grabbed his collar just in time. Slowly, he unlocked the door and pulled it open. Nothing. The porch was empty, bathed in pale moonlight. But as Ethan stepped outside, he saw them. Deep gouges in the wood, as if something with enormous claws had dragged its talons across the door. The same strange paw prints from before were scattered across the porch. Ethan's blood ran cold. He turned to go back inside when the sound of snapping branches echoed from the woods. He flicked the flashlight toward the trees. Yellow eyes glowed back at him. Then, whatever it was, let out a deep, guttural snarl. Max went berserk, barking and lunging. Ethan yanked him back and slammed the door shut, locking it tightly. Lena rushed to his side, panic in her eyes. "What was it?" she whispered. Ethan shook his head. "I don't know. But it's getting bolder." Max continued to growl, his eyes fixed on the door, his body rigid with tension. Something was out there, watching, waiting, and it wasn't going away. That night, Ethan and Lena didn't sleep, neither did Max. The howling returned, closer than ever, and the scratching. It started again, just before dawn. As dawn broke, Ethan finally drifted into a light sleep, only to be jolted awake by Max's furious barking. The dog was at the front window, his body tense, growling at something outside. Ethan threw on his jacket and stepped onto the porch, gripping the flashlight tightly. A heavy fog rolled in, wrapping around the house like ghostly fingers. Max stayed close, his hackles raised. Then, Ethan saw it. A dark figure standing at the edge of the forest, partially obscured by the mist. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, too unnatural. Its glowing yellow eyes locked onto him, unblinking. Then, in a blink, it moved. Not away, but closer. Ethan stumbled back into the house, slamming the door. "Lena, we have to leave, now." The next evening, the house was eerily silent. Even Max seemed restless, his body rigid as he watched the windows. Ethan had reinforced the doors with extra locks, but it did little to ease his growing fear. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, swallowing the forest. The howling returned, more chilling than before. It didn't come from one direction, but seemed to echo from all around them. Then, Max let out a sharp bark, rushing to the back door. Ethan followed, his breath catching, as he saw deep claw marks gouged into the wooden frame. The back porch light flickered, and for a moment, Ethan saw something move beyond the glass, something tall, its yellow eyes burning like embers. Ethan grabbed a knife from the counter. "We're leaving," he said, his voice barely a whisper. Lena, trembling, nodded and grabbed the car keys. They moved quickly, Max staying close, his growls never stopping. As they reached the car, Ethan felt it. That sensation of being watched, of something standing just out of sight. Lena turned the ignition, and the car roared to life. Headlights pierced through the fog, illuminating the edge of the trees, and there it stood, The creature was massive, hunched, its long limbs unnatural. It had the shape of a wolf but wasn't one. Its yellow eyes locked onto Ethan's, intelligent and unrelenting. Max barked furiously as they sped down the driveway, gravel kicking up behind them. Ethan refused to look back, but he could feel it, whatever it was, watching them disappear into the night. They never returned to that house again.